started. So I want to welcome everyone to the Coldwater Library. My name is Nikki Ball. I'm actually the Teen Services Coordinator here at the library, and I've been here since January. But in a previous life, one of my former jobs, I worked as the site manager of the Limberlost State Historic Site. And if you're unfamiliar with that, that's one of the historic homes of Jean Stratton-Porter, who we're going to talk about today. We've kind of gone around and mentioned our names. I started with Carol, and Carol's familiar with Jean Stratton-Porter. You read some of her books, correct? And you've seen like an reenactor. Yep. And then you guys have visited both of the historic sites.
Correct, and we were familiar with the books.
Okay, all right. Michelle, do you have any background in Jean Stratton-Porter?
I do. A very dear friend of ours was very interested in Jean Stratton-Porter, and so that made me interested, and I found one of her books in my in-laws' library. So
Wonderful. Okay. And what was your name?
Vicki.
Vicki. And your interest in Jean
Well,
Stratton-Porter?
she was my grandmother's favorite author,
Okay.
and I sort of inherited some of her books. And a couple of years ago, someone else had a talk here about her, and I got really interested. And this summer, I want to go to Rome City.
Yeah, wonderful. Oh, good. So it sounds like everyone has a little bit of background on Jean. So we'll kind of talk today about her life, but kind of focusing on a few different areas. We all know she's an author, but she was also a naturalist, a photographer, and an early filmmaker. So we'll kind of talk about all of these different ways in which she was kind of ahead of her time. So this is a picture here of Jean. This is actually at Rome City, Indiana, standing next to her favorite tree. And I love this quote. It says, "Turn her loose out of doors, give her good books, and leave her alone. You won't be disappointed in the woman who evolves." So those who love the outdoors and love nature and love literature, you're going to love Jean Stratton-Porter. And those are all things that I enjoy as well. I love nature, I love reading, and so when I learned about Jean's story, I was just kind of immediately drawn to it. I'm actually also a former English teacher, so when I started working at the Limberlost, it was just a wonderful fit between learning about her stories and her love of nature. So yeah, if you like those things, you're going to love her story. So I think these photos kind of represent all of those different things that she's done. So a couple of her books up here in the upper left-hand corner. Jean was one of the best-selling authors of the 20th century, and often people say she's one of the best-selling female authors, but she's male and female, one of the best-selling authors of the 20th century. So we almost kind of relate her to like a J.K. Rowling today. That's how many books she was selling. Her books were read throughout the world. They were translated in over a dozen languages, including Braille. So she was very, very well known in her time as a writer. She wrote both fiction and nonfiction, so we'll talk about that as well. Her most famous fiction book is A Girl of the Limberlost, which we have a copy here at the library if anyone is interested in checking that out. And so that's kind of what she's most known for, but we'll chat about a few of her other books too. Up in the upper right-hand corner, you see a table full of odds and ends. This was actually taken at one of her homes. Jean took this photo of all of her kind of nature guide gear. So she's got a hat and a fishing pole and all kinds of things, a camera. So she was an early conservationist, and we'll talk about that as well. But starting from a young age, she loved the outdoors. She loved birds especially. And she kind of used the outdoors as a setting for most of her novels. Then the lower right-hand side, you see this picture of an owl. Jean became a very, very well-known photographer. Her photography won lots of awards, and the means that she went to get some of her shots are pretty incredible, so we'll talk about that as well. And then later in her life, she became one of the first female movie producers during the silent film era. She wanted her books to be turned into movies, and so she didn't really want anyone else to do that for her. She wanted to have a hand in that, and so she did that as well. So again, we're talking, this is early 1900s, so for a woman to be doing all of these things, pretty incredible at that time. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Jean's childhood. This is a photograph of Jean from when she was about 10 years old. but she was born Geneva Grace. That was her given name, but they called her Jean. And she grew up in a small town near Wabash, Indiana called LaGros. She was the youngest of 12 children, and she was born in 1863, so right at the end of the Civil War. This is some of her family members. So her parents here on the left, Mark and Mary Stratton. Her father was an ordained minister and also a farmer. So she spent a lot of time outside following him around the farm and kind of learning about animals from him. And then her mother, Mary Stratton, was very knowledgeable about plants and their medicinal uses. So she learned a lot about plants from her mom. These are some of her siblings. There was a lot of tragedy in her family at that time. 2 of her siblings died from childhood diseases. One of her favorite brothers, his name was Laddie. She actually wrote a book called Laddie in honor of him, died from drowning when he was young. So a lot of tragedies in the family. And actually Jean's mom passed away when Jean was only 8 years old. Her mother suffered earlier in her life from typhoid fever and had always kind of had complications with that. So her mom died when she was pretty young. And that kind of sent her dad kind of in a, not really a downward spiral, but he had to sell the farm. They kind of moved into the town of Wabash in with some of Jean's older siblings. And so Jean grew up, on this big farm, loving the outdoors, loving birds, and then here she is in a city, and she didn't really like that. So she always kind of longed for the outdoors after that. But her nickname growing up was the Little Bird Woman. There's a great story about how when she was young, she was out playing and she was watching a red-tailed hawk, and all of a sudden a gun fired and that hawk fell from the tree. And she ran over, and her dad had shot the hawk, probably protecting the chickens and some of the farm animals. And she kind of put herself in between her dad's gun and the hawk to save the hawk. And she convinced her dad to let her nurse it back to health. And so she kind of earned this nickname, Little Bird Woman. But she was very attuned to the birds' songs, the birds' calls. She would get so familiar with the mother birds that she could feed the baby birds. She just always had this gift with birds, so that's kind of where that came from, is her childhood. An interesting thing about her siblings, this is her older sister Florence in the bottom lower corner. She actually ended up moving to Bronson, Michigan, and spent a lot of her life there. So Jean would come to Bronson to visit her every once in a while. Let's see, as Jean got to be a teenager, first of all, she never really liked school. I'm guessing a kid who loves the outdoors, they don't love sitting in a desk all day. So she never really took to school, although she was a talented writer. She didn't really enjoy going to school. And by the time she was in high school, she actually dropped out of high school. She always said it was to take care of an older, sick sibling. But from what I've read, it sounds more like it was a little bit of rebellion towards her father. He once again moved, he was kind of moving her around quite a bit. And one move, he forced her to sell some of her pet birds that she had. And it was like, she was like, okay, if you're gonna do that, then I'm dropping out of school. So she actually dropped out of high school. But she always loved learning, and back in those days they had these events called Chautauquas, these big gatherings where they have lots of different speakers on lots of different topics, and people would go to these big gatherings. And she would often go to a Chautauqua on Sylvan Lake, which is down in Rome City. And one year she went and she caught the eye of a gentleman, and his name was Charles Porter. Charles Porter was 13 years older than Jean, but she kind of interested him because most women at the Chautauquas were very into like gossiping and staying indoors, staying out of the hot sun, and Jean would go off fishing by herself, and kind of, she was just a little bit different than the other women, and I think Charles kind of was interested in that. So Charles was a pharmacist in the Decatur, Indiana area. And back then it was kind of customary, you didn't just like go up to a woman and start talking to her, you had to be formally introduced. And so they kind of had this very formal start to their relationship. They actually started letter writing for about 10 months before she kind of agreed like, hey, we're gonna maybe start dating. But eventually they did end up marrying. So that's Charles. Jean was always kind of hesitant of marriage. She didn't really love the idea of marriage, but I think she liked the idea of stability and security, and Charles kind of afforded her that because he was a successful pharmacist. She kind of felt like, you know, she's a little bit financially secure there. He also very much let her have her independence. She could go out in nature and kind of do her own thing, and so I think she liked that about him too. But that picture on the far right is a photo that Jean took of Charles. This is actually in the Bank of Geneva. So he started out as a pharmacist. He also had lots of farmland kind of down near Geneva, and he owned some land that they found oil on. So there was actually an oil boom down in Adams County at that time, and so he came into quite a bit of money from the oil boom. And that actually he started the Bank of Geneva, which is still running today, which is pretty cool. So they came into some money. They also had one daughter, Jeanette, and they were living in Decatur, and Jean didn't really like living in town. She wanted to move kind of more towards the country. So they moved to Geneva, Indiana, in a little house she called the Little Yeller House. But it was a small house, and once they kind of came into some money, she wanted to design her own home. So she and Charles took a trip to the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. And on the left here is a picture of what was called the Forestry Building. And this building caught Jean's eye, the architecture of it. It had big timber logs for columns and this big wraparound porch. So as she started designing her home in Geneva, that was kind of the inspiration behind it. And then this picture on the right is her home as it stands today. She called it the Limberlost cabin. And we say cabin very loosely because it was a mansion, and it's still, I would probably call it a mansion. It had 13 rooms, 7 fireplaces, very, very beautiful. But it's all made of Wisconsin cedar logs, and definitely would have been the biggest house in town. Probably the only house at that time that had indoor plumbing as well. So here's some photos from inside the house and around the house. So this is kind of the back porch area. The whole property is surrounded by a limestone fence. Jean collected the stone herself, and she had help, but she collected the stones from the Wabash River and built this really cool fence all the way around the property. It has holes specifically in the fence to let the animals in and out of her yard. So a very animal-friendly yard. If anyone's read, one of her books is called The Harvester. Has anyone read that one? There's a scene of a porch, and that porch is very much kind of highlighted in that novel. So she definitely used this house in some of her books. Just kind of another angle of it. We do know that there was a windmill in the yard. They did have indoor plumbing. This is kind of a cool view. This big window on the left here, she had a conservatory room, so almost like a greenhouse inside where she could grow her plants. There was a carriage house. They had hired help. A gentleman lived on the property. This was his room. So you can see the inside. It's Queen Anne rustic style, so lots of pocket doors. There's like a really cool trifold door there. Just really, really beautiful. This room's actually featured in A Girl of the Limberlost. Jean ended up writing herself in as kind of a minor character, and there's a scene in that character's home, and this room's described almost to a T in A Girl of the Limberlost. Jean could play a few instruments, as could her daughter Jeanette. So this is what's called the music room. What's really neat about this room, around the top of the ceiling and around kind of the bottom, there's this neat plaster called Lincrusta, and that was just, I'm sure, cost a lot of money at that time. It's very fragile, but very beautiful. You can kind of see into her study there. While I worked there, this chair kind of has an interesting story. So there's a photograph there of her daughter next to, or sitting at a piano, and this chair is in that photograph. When Jean moved from this house, she sold that chair, and that chair got resold and resold and resold and changed hands a bunch of different times. But everyone that owned this chair knew it was a Gene Stratton-Porter chair, and eventually someone donated it back to the museum. But it was kind of in disrepair, and they restored it, and I got to go pick it up and set it back on the floor in the exact spot that you see in the photograph, and that kind of gave me chills when we did that. It was pretty cool. So in the cabin is kind of where Jean's writing career started. She enjoyed being a homemaker, she liked that, but tragedy kind of struck while she was living there. Her husband had a lot of his businesses, and the bank were all in downtown Geneva. All those buildings were mostly made out of wood, and one night there was a huge fire and a lot of the downtown burned. And Charles had to reinvest a lot of his own money to rebuild those buildings, and so she kind of realized that even though they had this money, that could still be lost, and she wanted to have her own money, her own financial independence. So she started writing. Another reason she started writing, her father passed away, and it kind of caused her a lot of anxiety, and writing sort of helped her get through that. So she started writing. She actually wrote an anonymous story called The Strike at Shane's, sent it off, and it won an award, but it was anonymous. She didn't want anyone to know that she had sent it away for fear that it was going to be rejected or made fun of, and so for a long time no one knew who wrote that, but scholars kind of agree now that that is a Gene Stratton-Porter story. Then she wrote an article about birds, and when she sent that off to a magazine, they said, "Hey, we like your article, but we need some pictures to go along with it." And at that time, most pictures of birds were of dead birds. It wasn't easy to get pictures of birds. If you've ever gone out birding, you know birds move a lot. And the camera equipment that they had at that time, it just wasn't easy to get shots of live birds. So one Christmas, Jeanette and Charles bought Jean a camera for Christmas, just like this little box camera here. And so she started taking photos and developing them in her bathroom. So she would cover the bathroom window with towels and stuff towels under the door to keep the light out, and she started developing in the bathroom. And with her husband being a pharmacist, that's how she kind of got the chemicals, and he kind of helped her with that process. So some of her early photography was done in the house. This is Jeanette in front of the fireplace, and you can see a blue heron and a golden eagle mounted on either side. Jeanette would play with those birds and dress them up for fun. As an only child, I guess, she needed some playmates, and so those are the birds having a tea party in the conservatory. But there's a fun story, like the very first photo that she ever took, she had a live bird, a parrot called Major, and she took a picture of Major, and when she was like developing it and she started seeing the picture coming out, she went screaming through the cabin, like so excited that she could actually do this. So she says that she spent about $1,000 in camera equipment, which today is about $30,000. So she bought different cameras for different, distances and whatnot. She wanted to photograph these birds, so she would use those like squeeze bulb to make the camera go, and she bought like hundreds of feet of cable so that she could stand really far from the birds and capture them. So yeah, she went through great lengths for her photography. So luckily, Jean had a perfect place to go to take these pictures. Geneva, Indiana was adjacent to the Limberlost swamp, which was almost 20,000 acre wetlands in that area. At the same time that Jean was living there, of course, they found oil there, so all these oil rigs were going up, and people wanted to farm this area, so they were draining the swamp as she was living there. But there were still pieces of it left, and she would go out there to photograph nature. People were afraid of the swamp. There were rattlesnakes out there, native rattlesnakes. It was full of mosquitoes, it was hot, and no one wanted to go out there. But Jean would put on pants, which most women would do at the time. She'd carry a gun, and she would go out into the swamp to get these pictures, which is pretty cool. So that's a picture she took of the Limberlost there. This picture of her was kind of taken later in life for like a photo shoot, but that is something similar to what she would wear out there. So these are some of her photographs. This is a blue heron. So she would sometimes have to lay in the water for like hours at a time, just not to scare the birds. This one in the bottom is very interesting. It's a black vulture chick. It's like the first known photograph ever of a black vulture chick. And there's, in her book, Freckles, very important scene with a black vulture. So that kind of inspired that part of the book. The owl photo, there's a great story that she was trying to get a photo of a screech owl. And of course, owls, it's nighttime, it's hard to get a picture of an owl. So one night she heard one calling in her backyard, so she opened her kitchen window and called the owl, and the owl flew into the kitchen, and she took a picture of the owl in the kitchen. So she was very good at imitating the calls too. But when she would go out into the swamp, she had two gentlemen that helped her. They were kind of, I think one of them was more like he worked in the oil industry, so he was out there all the time, and he would kind of keep an eye out for things like, hey Jean, I found this nest of whatever, and he would kind of guide her out there and set up the ladders for her and stuff like that. So she did have helpers around the Limberlost. So Jean also got into not only birds but moths was kind of her specialty. Moths and butterflies, but mostly moths. And so she's one of the very first people to ever study moths and photograph moths. In fact, the state entomologist of Indiana today says he was inspired by her work, which is really cool. So especially these giant silk moths, so Cecropia moths, Luna moths, we're talking moths that are quite large. So she would go find the caterpillars, bring the caterpillars in the house, let them hang out in the conservatory. When they went into their cocoons, she would sleep next to them because they often emerged at night. She wanted to hear if they started coming out of their cocoon. She would even like pin them to her pillow so the vibration would kind of wake her up. So she would have moths flying around the house, and just kind of an interesting woman, I'm sure. So here's a picture of the bathroom. This is where she would develop her photos. This is kind of cool. This is a red light. It's essentially like a flashlight with like a red piece of glass in there. So that's what she would use as she was developing film. She also started hand coloring her film so that in her books she could have colored pictures in the books. So she was also a pretty talented artist as well. In the cabin we had quite a few pictures of her paintings that she had done on the walls. So now that she had these pictures and all this inspiration, Jean's writing career really started to take off. So her very first novel is called Song of the Cardinal, and that sold pretty well. And then she started to write these books that took place in the Limberlost. So Freckles is kind of the first of what we maybe call the Limberlost trilogy. Takes place out there, and then Girl in the Limberlost is kind of like a sequel. You can read them standalone, but Limberlost will talk a little bit about some of the characters in Freckles. But this one definitely became her bestseller. So it's about a young girl who needs some money for schooling, and she meets a woman called the Bird Woman, which is Jean kind of writing herself in the novel. And in order to earn money, the Bird Woman says, hey, I'm looking for these moth specimens. If you can go out and find these moths, I'll pay you big money for it. And so there's a lot of moth information in here, lots of Limberlost information in there. So that sold really well, but Jean's heart was really in her nonfiction. She wanted to write nature studies. Well, the publishers were like, these aren't gonna sell, no one's gonna love to buy a book all about moths. So she kind of made a deal with them that for every fiction book she wrote, they would publish a nonfiction book. And so she kind of went back and forth every year or two with writing those types of books, so every other year. So a lot of her books were written in the Limberlost cabin, which is pretty cool. She became really, really famous. So people around town, here's this huge house right in the middle of town. They would come up to her house, look in the windows, knock on the door. They wanted to meet her, and she hated that. She really liked her privacy, and so she decided to leave the Limberlost. She kept the home there. Charles kept the bank there, so he kind of lived in that home. And she went and built another home in Rome City, which is on Sylvan Lake, the same lake where she met Charles. And so she decided to build a new house. The new house looks a lot like the first house, but she called it Wildflower Woods. It's a little confusing because in a lot of old photographs like this one, it's it's written on the photograph Limberlost cabin, so there's often a lot of confusion between the two, and because they look so similar. But Wildflower Woods is located in Rome City, so a little bit further north in Indiana, and it was much more secluded. Even today, this property closes in the winter because it's so hard to get to. It's so out there. But it's very similar to the Limberlost cabin as far as the layout, but there are things about the Limberlost she didn't like that she changed for this house. Picture of today. So her conservatory went from being maybe the size of this little area to a full room. So this is like almost like a, what would we call it, Four Seasons room, surrounded by windows. All the windows outside of this conservatory have like a little shelf to put bird seed, so the birds would come right up to the window. Her fireplaces got much bigger, more elaborate. As they were building the house, they uncovered lots of what's called pudding stone, this cool conglomerate. So she built this whole fireplace out of pudding stone. There's a whole other fireplace made out of field stone that has like cool shapes built into it. She built an entirely separate dark room. So that picture's the window, all covered in red stained glass. It's pretty cool. This is the entryway. This is almost identical to the Limberlost entryway, just the wood's a little bit darker, but she loved these newel posts, lots of built-in cabinets, more pocket doors. And then the outside is probably what's most significantly different. If you go to the Limberlost cabin in Geneva, you are like right off of US 20, and semis are roaring by. The red gold tomato factory is right next door. It's very much right in town, and this is just very tranquil and peaceful. There's huge old growth trees, probably some of the oldest trees in Indiana that stand on that property, huge trees. This huge walkway that she built for her wisteria to hang from. She built these big owl pillars with more pudding stone and limestone, and it's just really beautiful. There's kind of this natural spring that flows, and I'm sure they have lots of weddings and things that take place there. It's just very, very peaceful. I should mention, I'm going to go back one. This is really where Jean her conservation efforts really started coming into play. She had watched the Limberlost swamp disappear before her eyes. It went from a 17,000 acre swamp to almost nothing. And that was heartbreaking to her, and she was unable to stop it. When she moved here, she had name and money, and so when she wanted to get things done, she could buy the property. She would go around Noble County and find rare plants and transplant them to her house. I think one spring they said something like, I don't know, like 1,200 plants she did like within a week. She had all these people out, finding plants and trees and bringing them to her property. So she really tried to preserve those things on that property as best she could. She was also writing to the legislature, trying to get things changed to kind of prevent another Limberlost from happening again. But Jean only lived there for about 5 years. She wrote a few books there, and then her health kind of started failing. She was in her mid-50s, and doctors suggested that she move to a warmer climate. It's kind of a big thing that they did back then. And so she had some family out in California, and that's where she went next. So she left Rome City. I should mention at this time, I mentioned that Charles was still living in Geneva, right, her husband. He kind of just visited on the weekends here in Rome City, so they were very much living kind of different lives. And then when she went to California, he would visit occasionally, but he mostly stayed in Indiana. So she had her own money, and they just, I don't know, it's hard to tell from her letters and stuff exactly what their relationship was, but they were married until the end of her life, but we don't know how much contact they had. So she kind of left Charles behind a little bit, and moved out to California. So like I said, she had a lot of family that had already moved out there, so it was kind of fitting. She moved to Bel Air and had one of the first mansions in Bel Air, California. And her life really took an interesting turn. She went from like wanting to have her privacy and being really secluded to like hobnobbing with celebrities, and like so when she went out to California, she was like living a lot more of a lavish lifestyle. She also started writing poetry, so this is the first time some of her poetry was getting published. The Firebird is one of those books. They kind of say after World War I, her book sales kind of went downhill. Her books are very much like, they view a lot of things with rose-colored glasses, I guess you could say, and people didn't think they were very realistic. So her books started to get like more criticism. And she actually sold one of her poems for like $12,000 when she moved out to California, and that was like, that was big. That'd be big money today. It was really big money then. So she kind of started writing this new style that was just a little bit different from her novels. And as I mentioned earlier, this is also where she started her movie production career. A company had turned one of her books, I think it was Freckles, into a movie, and she did not like what they did to it. They changed a lot of things, and so she said, hey, if we're going to make my books into movies, I'm going to be a part of that. So she started Jean Stratton-Porter Productions, and has a gentleman, James Leo Meehan, directs them and helps produce them. He actually ended up marrying her daughter, so that became her son-in-law. And they did a few of her movies. A lot of them, unfortunately, are lost to this day. They don't have them anymore. And again, they were silent films. And shortly after, silent films, they got away with silent films, and her company, I guess, didn't really keep up with the technology, so it didn't last very long. But yeah, so they did Turn Laddie, Harvester. I'm blanking on what some of the other ones are now, but this is a photo from one of the movies, and Jean's kind of, I don't know if she's coaching the actors here, but she's kind of not in the movie, but that's during production. And then sadly, kind of goes along with Jean and the rest of her family, she also died tragically at a young age. So just in 1924, so just a few years after moving to California, at the age of 61, she was involved in a railway accident. Jean never liked to drive. She had a fear of driving, so she was being driven, and her car stalled or stopped over the tracks of a streetcar, and the streetcar hit them, and she was killed. So that was in 1924. Charles, her husband, flew out to help make arrangements, but before he got there, her daughter Jeanette decided to have her buried in California. But it was always Jean's wish to be buried. She said, like, don't put up a monument for me, like, just plant a tree where I am. So years later, some of her descendants actually had her body moved, and now she's buried at the Rome City house. There is a monument over it, but she is amongst her trees, so. But we kind of love that Jean's story kind of lives on today. If you haven't been down to the Limberlost, today you can go to what's restored Limberlost Swamp. Starting maybe about 30 years ago, there's a gentleman, he was a farmer, and he was seeing all the farms flood. The farms would flood every year, and he realized, like, the reason these are flooding is because this is naturally a swamp. And so he kind of started to work with the Indiana DNR to buy up pieces of property and turn them back into swampland. So Jean's Swamp was almost completely gone when she left, and today there's almost 2,000 acres of restored swamp there. So there's a couple different nature preserves. This one where I'm on the bridge with these school kids, this is the Loblolly Nature Preserve, and then the one on the left is the Limberlost. So you can go out there, and what's incredible is that all these birds disappeared from this area for so long, and as soon as the swamp came back, all these birds that people hadn't seen in forever started returning, which is really neat. So it's a big area for bird watching today. Rightfully so. Jean would have wanted it that way. This is a map of the Limberlost that if you go to their visitor center, you can get it. So if you visit the house, they'll kind of show you the way to some of the other nature preserves. But if you can imagine, almost, this entire chunk of map would have been the Limberlost swamp, and today all these sections that are in black are what's been preserved or brought back of the swamp. So it's pretty cool what they've done. Alright, so that's kind of Jean's story in a nutshell. Hopefully, even if you're familiar with her story, hopefully you learned maybe a little new tidbit. But I encourage you to check out the homes. Again, I'm not affiliated with the state historic sites anymore, but I have lots of friends who still work there, and they are wonderful. They're you can go there for like $8 and get a tour, and you will get a top-notch tour of the homes. And they do all sorts of other programs, bird watching programs, other history and art programs. So they've always got something going on at those places. And it's just really cool, and they're only within an hour or two away. So I encourage you to visit there. Yeah. Do you guys have any questions?
Did her daughter married, and she must have had offspring then?
She did. So Jeanette's an interesting story. So Jeanette actually had a first husband before the movie producer.
Oh, okay.
And he was not a nice man. He was actually in the oil industry in Geneva. And when she filed for divorce, she said it was because he had an alcohol problem. It was kind of abusive. But she had 2 daughters with him. And actually one she named Jean Stratton after her mother. So there was another Jean, little Jean, running around. And older Jean knew those granddaughters. They lived out in California with her. But Jeanette, her daughter, also helped with the movies. She wrote they're silent films, but she wrote kind of the screenplay of those. And then later in life, I think after Jean's death, Jeanette actually wrote a book that's based in the Limberlost too. That's very much based on her mom, and so lots of little like stories that we know are true kind of make their way into her book. So she was a writer as well. Yep. Thanks. Yeah. Charles, I should mention, he only lived 2 years after Jean. You know, he was 13 years her senior, so he was in his 70s. And he was buried here in Indiana with not too much fanfare. But yeah, like I said, he did go out. He would visit her in California. They were technically still married, but very much kind of living their own lives then.
How did the homes become part of the Indiana
Yeah, oh, good question. So
state?
the Limberlost cabin, like I said, it kind of stayed with Charles for a while. He was living there. Jeanette actually kind of would vacation there. Jeanette got married in the Limberlost cabin, I think, with her first marriage. So they kept that for a while. And then it was sold, you know, Jean was famous when that sold. So that person who bought it actually started opening it up for tours. And so it was always very much like kept the way it was. And then eventually I know before the State Museum, it was like a DNR property, and then it kind of transferred to the State Museum. But so Limberlost has always been a home. I don't know as much about the Rome City site. And when that sold, if it was right after her death or how long that stayed in their family, but that is also very, very well preserved. So I'm guessing they probably turned it into a museum not too long after. The home in California is under a private owner. I don't know much about it, but I know like over the last decade or so it was under a lot of construction. So someone was working on it, but I don't know much about it. And then it's kind of interesting, like over time, they actually discovered some homes that she owned, like in Fort Wayne. She bought some homes like for her siblings once she got her own money. So they do know of some other properties that were owned by her that just weren't, you know, big mansions. And actually in Geneva, at the Limberlost cabin, the home right next to it is the home that she and Charles first lived in, and that's still standing, and it's just privately owned. Someone lives in it, but it's still there. Probably looks a lot different today.
How far is Geneva from here?
About 2 hours. It's about an hour south of Fort Wayne. Yeah, it's a good place to visit. And like I said, I'd recommend going out to the nature preserves too. You can actually, they call it rent a naturalist, so you can schedule a naturalist to take you out into the swamp. And if you have a book that you like if you're a Girl of the Limberlost fan, he'll take you out and say, this is where this was supposed to take place, or but where different books took place. So you can really kind of tailor it to what you're interested in. Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
There is a program survey on the back table, so if you'd like to fill that out, we'd appreciate it. If you want to take the time, there's water there too if you didn't get one on the way in and want one on the way out. And these books are up for grabs if you want to check either of them out, Freckles and A Girl with the Limberlost. And then this is a book that, it's kind of a comprehensive biography of Jean Stratton-Porter. There have been lots of things written, but this is by far the best one. But this is my personal copy, but if you wanted to read it, I'm sure we could order it in through our interlibrary loan system and get you a copy of it.
I would like Freckles.
You want
Is
Freckles?
that from?
Yep, this is
Coldwater?
here.
Okay.
Yep, we just got these in recently, so yes, it's a good one. I like Freckles.